Hello and welcome to the fifth video of the Sheridan College online degree breadth elective course, Introduction to Medieval History. In today's video, we'll move into the last century of the early Middle Ages. We'll see under the rule of Emperor Basil II, the resurgence of the Byzantine Empire, and watch its borders expand. In the Islamic world, we'll see the fragmentation of the Abbasid caliphates with the rise of new, powerful regional dynasties such as the Fatimids in North Africa and the Buyids in Persia. In the West, we'll witness the end of the Carolingian Empire as Europe descends into bloodshed and war. In England, we'll see how Alfred the Great takes the first steps towards uniting the Anglo-Saxon people and the creation of a unified Kingdom of England. We'll also see new peoples arise, the Norse, better known as the Vikings, who will rapidly expand across Europe, both east and west, transforming the Western world. In the east, the Vikings will assimilate with Slavic people and together give rise to Kyivan Rus, the ancestor of modern-day Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. In the west, the Vikings will claim and settle territory in Francia and England. As expert seamen, we'll see them cross the Atlantic Ocean and found settlements in Iceland, Greenland, and even for a time on the coast of North America itself, the first Europeans to reach the New World. As the first chapter of the Middle Ages comes to a close, everything begins to change. All that today in the fifth video of Introduction to Medieval History. The learning objectives for this lesson are: number 1, understand the decline and breakup of the Carolingian Empire and articulate its legacy for European history. Number 2, describe the importance of the Viking Age, including its effect on the unification of England and the development of the Kyivan Rus state. And number 3, describe the changes to the Byzantine Empire and the Abbasid caliphates during the 9th and 10th centuries. In the early 9th century, most of Western Europe was united under the rule of the Carolingian dynasty. The great Frankish leader Charlemagne imposed his rule over a vast domain, which included most of northern Italy in the south, along with all of modern-day France and Germany. But this domain, once part of the Roman Empire, was home to many different peoples and languages, and the empire masked many regional differences. Many different ethnic groups, including Franks, Celts, Saxons, Lombards, Jews, Byzantines, and many others across a vast span of territory. In the west, the area which was once the province of Gaul in the old Roman Empire, the Latin language persisted and was the main language of everyday life. Although slowly, it was changing into an early form of French. In the east, various Germanic languages dominated. According to his 9th century biographer Einhard, Charlemagne prided himself at being able to speak both Latin and German. But the empire he created would not last. When Charlemagne died in 814, his empire passed to his son Louis, whom later generations would call Louis the Pious, due to his very public interest in the Christian religion and his close relationship with the papacy. Louis presented himself as a Christian emperor who ruled over a unified land. His imperial court and capital was in the northern European city of Aachen, which is situated in what is today Western Germany. Aachen had been the seat of the Carolingian dynasty since the days of Pepin the Short. From Aachen, Louis set out to create a unified version of Western Christianity. He lavished money on monasteries and mandated that the rule of St. Benedict should be the default system for monks and nuns everywhere in the empire. However, the later years of Louis's reign would be marked by civil war and family strife. Decades of conflict which came at a terrible cost. 4 sons from 2 marriages, each wanting a share of their father's empire, would plunge the empire into war many times. When he died in 840 CE, his eldest son, Lothar, claimed the entirety of the empire for himself. However, almost immediately, Francia was plunged into a brutal civil war between Lothar and his younger brothers Louis II, sometimes called Louis the German, and his half-brother Charles II, sometimes called Charles the Bald. This civil war between three brothers would have profound implications for the rest of European history. In advance of their rebellion against their older brother in 842 CE, the younger two brothers, Charles and Louis, met with their armies near the city of Strasbourg to sign a military alliance. The document they agreed to survives to this day, and it is remarkable. The Oaths of Strasbourg demonstrated for the first time how much Europe had changed since the days of the old Roman Empire. For the brothers swore their oaths in the languages of each other's army, so that both could understand. So that the soldiers of Louis from the east could understand, Charles swore his oath in the Frankish Germanic dialect. In turn, so that the soldiers of Charles from the west could understand, Louis swore his oath in their Romance language. But it was not Latin. For the first time in recorded history, we see the oldest example of French. The Oaths of Strasbourg are remembered today not just as a military alliance, but as a foreshadowing of the future birth of the nation-states of France and Germany. A year later, all three brothers would sign a peace agreement and divide Francia between them. The eastern side of the empire, which corresponds roughly to modern-day Germany and Austria, was to go to Louis. The western side, which corresponds to modern-day France, would belong to Charles. The oldest brother, Lothar, was given the jewel of the empire, northern Italy, and a strip of land which effectively divided Europe in half. Centuries before the world wars of the 20th century, the basic outlines of the modern countries of France and Germany had been born. The narrow land which divided them, which was given the name of Lothar, the kingdom of Lotharingia, the echo of which survives to this day in its modern name, the Lorraine, an area of France which borders modern-day Belgium and Germany. The Lorraine would witness some of the fiercest fighting during World War I and II, a medieval reminder of a bitter feud between brothers. Over the next centuries, the domains of the great Emperor Charlemagne would be further subdivided, and eventually the Carolingian dynasty would come to an end altogether. The demise of the Carolingian Empire during the 9th and 10th century was hastened in part by the rise of a new people in the north of Europe, from a place called Scandinavia. The Norse people, or as they're better known today, the Vikings. Between the 8th and 11th centuries, the Vikings would embark on a series of raids, migrations, and explorations which would change the Western world forever. We know about their culture today from a variety of sources, including archaeology, their ancient runic inscriptions, and above all, from their stories, their sagas, composed over hundreds of years in the Old Norse language. The Vikings were renowned as great warriors, but they were also farmers and traders. Their period of expansion and migration is sometimes referred to as the Viking Age, and everywhere they went, they changed history. In the west, the Vikings raided and established settlements in northwest Francia, which still bears their name, Normandy, from Northman. They explored and raided the Iberian Peninsula, southern Italy and Sicily. And in England too, they began to raid the east coast and claim land. Here the Vikings encountered the Anglo-Saxon people. As we've seen in our previous videos, beginning in the 6th century, the former Roman province of Britannia had been conquered and divided into small Germanic kingdoms. Over the centuries, a common Anglo-Saxon, or English, culture developed on the island, while Celtic culture and languages continued in Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. By the 9th century, the formerly pagan Anglo-Saxons had also become Christianized. Nevertheless, despite cultural and linguistic similarities, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had remained separate from one another and were sometimes at war. However, by the mid-9th century, faced with a new threat from the Vikings, the Anglo-Saxons would begin to unite. The first steps towards unifying the English kingdoms were taken by King Alfred, who later generations would call Alfred the Great, who ruled Wessex in the late 9th century, one of the 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms which later made up modern England today. Under his leadership, Wessex and several of the other kingdoms collaborated on building a series of defensive settlements across southern England and established navies to use against Viking raiders. By 878 CE, Alfred and the Anglo-Saxons had won a decisive victory against the Vikings, and subsequently they came to peace with them. England was to be divided between the Anglo-Saxon territory and the Viking-ruled Danelaw, which was composed of northern England and much of the eastern side of the island. While the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms continued to be separate during Alfred's lifetime, he started a process that would eventually lead to the unification of the entire island just over 2 decades later, and eventually the defeat of the Vikings altogether. As expert seamen, the Vikings explored further west into the Atlantic Ocean, going further than any European had ever ventured before. They established colonies in Iceland where their descendants lived to this day, and over 1,000 years would develop the distinctive Icelandic language and culture. They pushed further still, reaching Greenland, and even more remarkable, nearly 500 years before Christopher Columbus, the Vikings reached the continent of North America itself in what is today Newfoundland, Canada. Under the leadership of Leif Erikson, they established a winter outpost at a place known today as L'Anse aux Meadows. They called it Vinland, but they were not the first people there. For tens of thousands of years, the indigenous peoples of the Americas had thrived on 2 continents, and now, for the first time, the old world and the new were connected once again. The Vikings called the people they met there Skraelings, and first contact did not go well. There was frequent fighting on both sides. After about 2 decades, for reasons unknown, the Vikings abandoned Vinland, never to return. Over time, knowledge of these new lands became myths and legends. The Europeans would not be back again until the 16th century. In the east, the Vikings took control over large parts of Eastern Europe, establishing settlements there. The Vikings in the east were referred to as the Rus, a word possibly derived from the Old Finnic language word rutski, meaning rowers. Over time, the Rus assimilated with the local Finnish and Slavic population, and together these peoples united into the great medieval state Kyivan Rus by the late 9th, early 10th century. According to the primary chronicle, the earliest record of Kyivan Rus composed in the early 12th century, a Norseman named Rurik established himself as a leader over an amalgamation of several Slavic and Finnic tribes in Novgorod, which is in modern-day Russia. Under his leadership, the proto-state began to expand south. One of Rurik's successors, Oleg of Novgorod, would conquer the Slavic city of Kyiv, which was strategically located near the Dnieper and Desna river systems. Kyiv would eventually serve as the capital of the medieval state of Kyivan Rus, the ancestor of modern-day Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. The move south also brought the Rus into conflict with 2 other powerful groups, the Byzantine Empire and the Khazars, semi-nomadic Turkic people who controlled a vast commercial empire. Over the next several decades, Kyivan Rus would frequently be at war with both groups, but eventually, under the Grand Prince Vladimir I, the Rus allied themselves with the Byzantine Empire. Vladimir married the sister of the great Byzantine Emperor Basil II, and perhaps more important for history, he adopted the Byzantine form of Christianity. In marrying the daughter of the emperor, the Rus had found a new, powerful ally. Under the leadership of Basil II, the Byzantine Empire had re-emerged in the early 11th century as a powerful and influential state. His reign of over 49 years made him the longest-serving Byzantine emperor in history. While the early years of Basil's reign were dominated by several civil wars, the latter half included the expansion of the empire, including the subjugation of the Kingdom of Bulgaria. By the end of his reign, the empire had expanded south to Syria, in the east all the way to Georgia and Armenia, and in the west it now included southern Italy and the Balkans. After the death of Basil, the Byzantine Empire was more diverse and cosmopolitan than it had been in centuries, including many more languages, ethnic groups, and cultures. Similarly, to the south, the vast domain of the Abbasid Caliphates included an incredible array of languages and cultures. Although nominally the Muslim conquest had created a degree of unity, the administration of such a vast empire proved difficult. Just as the Umayyads had struggled to control their domains, the Abbasid Caliphates were also confronted with similar administrative difficulties. A revolt of the Zanji, who were slaves taken from sub-Saharan Africa in the late 9th century, would devastate the Abbasid economy in the heartland of Iraq. Weakness in the Abbasid state allowed for regional powers to begin to exert more and more influence. Over time, some of these regional powers effectively gained autonomy in much of their affairs, leading to the fragmentation of the Abbasid Empire. Two of the most important of these groups were the Buyids from Iran and the Fatimids in North Africa, both of which represented the Shia branch of Islam. In Iran, the Buyids would establish a caliphate which would control most of modern-day Iran and Iraq in the 10th and 11th centuries. At its peak, the Buyid dynasty created public works such as hospitals and dams, and created a culture which supported many scholars, poets, artists, and craftsmen. The most important of the new regional powers to emerge in the 10th century were, however, the Fatimids in North Africa. They were also Shia Muslims and claimed descent from Muhammad's daughter Fatima. By 910 CE, allying themselves with the Berbers of North Africa, the Fatimids controlled what is now Tunisia and Libya. Soon after, the Fatimid Caliphate expanded eastward and would eventually rule Egypt, southern Syria, and the western Arabian Peninsula. Similar to the Buyids, they also presided over a glittering culture centered on their capital city of Cairo. For the last century of the Middle Ages, Islamic culture flourished across the southern half of the old Roman Empire. However, as we'll see in the 11th century, increasing religious partisanship would increasingly create massive divisions in the Islamic world, splitting the two halves, Sunni and Shia Muslims, further apart. The last century of the early Middle Ages was a time of great fragmentation, disruption, and war. Yet from the ashes of these conflicts, the foundation of the High Middle Ages would be built. In the second half of this course, as we move into the High Middle Ages, we'll see the flowering of medieval culture across the Old World as both Europe and the Islamic world reach new pinnacles of cultural achievement. Yet, we'll also see one of the great tragic conflicts of the past millennia as the Christian and Islamic world go to war in the Crusades. However, before we finish the first half of this course, next week we'll take a closer look at medieval society. We'll move briefly away from the overall narrative of medieval history of war and states and examine the unique societal institutions which had developed during the early Middle Ages. We'll learn about feudalism and medieval kingship, how nobles created webs of military alliances, and why the pyramid structure of feudalism that you might have been taught in high school is actually a myth and didn't exist. We'll also see what it was like to be a medieval peasant. We'll look at the institution of manorialism and serfdom. All that next week on Introduction to Medieval History.